The anxious person thinks it's their fault, but it's a narcissist and avoidant trap. It's incredibly common for someone with anxious tendencies in relationships to carry a heavy, unfair burden, the belief that everything is their fault. That nagging voice inside, whispering, if only I were better, if only I did more, maybe this would work. But here's the truth, that kind of thinking, it's a trap. A trap laid by the interplay between two very complex attachment styles, the narcissist and the avoidant. When you're with someone who's avoidant, they pull away just when you want to get closer. And if they're also narcissistic, their self-focus and lack of empathy means they rarely meet you halfway emotionally. You're left chasing, doubting yourself, questioning your worth, and it's easy to internalize the blame. But listen, your anxious feelings aren't a flaw. They're a natural response to a confusing and emotionally inconsistent dynamic. The fault doesn't lie in your desire to connect or your sensitivity. It lies in the mismatch and the emotional games played by those who aren't wired to meet you where you need. The moment you start recognizing this dynamic, you shift the power back to yourself. You stop being the person who's endlessly apologizing and start becoming the person who understands the dance, calls it out, and chooses healthier connections. You deserve someone who meets your vulnerability with openness, not avoidance or manipulation. And that's where healing starts, in breaking free from the trap and reclaiming your worth. When someone has an anxious attachment style, they often find themselves carrying a heavy load of self-blame whenever things don't go well in a relationship. It's like their default setting is to assume that every problem, every disagreement, every moment of distance is somehow their fault. This happens because anxious individuals are incredibly sensitive to signs of rejection or abandonment. When their partner pulls away or seems unavailable, their mind races to fill in the blanks. And most of the time, it lands on the harshest possible explanation that they aren't enough or that they did something wrong. This self-blame isn't just a passing thought. It becomes a deeply ingrained pattern that shapes how they see themselves and their worth in relationships. This tendency to internalize blame comes from a place of wanting connection desperately. The anxious person is wired to seek reassurance and closeness. So when those needs aren't met, it feels like a personal failure. They start dissecting their own actions and words, replaying conversations to figure out where they slipped up. Did they text too much? Were they too needy? Did they say something that annoyed their partner? These questions flood their mind endlessly because the anxious brain tries to find a way to fix what's broken, even if the problem isn't theirs to fix. What makes this dynamic even harder is that anxious people often have an intense desire to please. They're hyper aware of how their behavior affects the other person and try to adapt themselves to avoid conflict or distance. But this adaptive behavior can backfire. Instead of feeling secure, they feel like they're walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting and second-guessing their own feelings and instincts. The underlying message they absorb is that their natural way of being, sensitive, expressive, vulnerable, is somehow too much or not the right way to be loved. Because anxious individuals are so focused on what they perceive as their shortcomings, they rarely consider how much the other person's frustrations contribute to the tension. They miss the fact that some people just aren't capable of meeting them where they need, or that the problem might be the partner's emotional unavailability rather than the anxious person's behavior. This is why self-blame becomes a kind of emotional prison. It keeps them stuck trying to fix themselves instead of recognizing that the issue might lie outside their control. In reality, this self-blame is a coping mechanism, an attempt to make sense of confusing emotional signals and regain some control over a relationship that feels unpredictable. It's important to understand that while feeling responsible is understandable, it's not always accurate or fair. When anxiety convinces someone that everything is their fault, it blinds them to the bigger picture and makes it nearly impossible to break free from the cycle of doubt and insecurity. The dynamic between a narcissistic partner and an avoidant partner creates a complex and painful emotional environment that deeply affects someone with an anxious attachment style. When these two personality traits combine, they set up a relationship pattern that is almost designed to fuel anxiety and confusion. A narcissistic person tends to be self-seekered, craving admiration and control, while often lacking empathy for their partner's feelings. On the other hand, an avoidant individual is emotionally distant, uncomfortable with too much closeness, and quick to withdraw when things get intense. When these traits intersect, the anxious partner is caught in a push-pull game where their needs for connection are consistently unmet or misunderstood. The narcissist's self-centeredness means they prioritize their own needs above the relationship's emotional balance. They may charm and draw the anxious partner in initially, but over time, their lack of empathy and emotional availability leaves the anxious person feeling unseen and unimportant. The anxious partner's attempts to seek reassurance and closeness can be met with indifference, criticism, or manipulation, which only deepens their insecurity. The narcissist's desire for control can make the anxious partner feel trapped in a cycle where they're constantly striving for approval, but never quite getting it, creating a sense of never being in. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner's instinct is to pull away when emotions become overwhelming or when they feel pressured to open up. This distancing behavior is terrifying for an anxious person because it confirms their deepest fears of abandonment and rejection. The avoidance withdrawal creates an emotional void that the anxious partner desperately tries to fill, often escalating their neediness and attempts to reconnect. But the more the anxious partner reaches out, the more the avoidant retreats, which amplifies the anxious partner's stress and self-doubt. This dance of approach and avoidance becomes exhausting and confusing, making it difficult for the anxious individual to feel safe or secure. Together, the narcissist and avoidant traits feed into each other in ways that can devastate the anxious partner's emotional well-being. The narcissist's emotional unavailability combined with the avoidant's withdrawal creates an environment where the anxious person's natural need for intimacy and reassurance is constantly frustrated. This creates a relentless cycle of hope and disappointment where moments of connection are quickly followed by emotional distance. Over time, this cycle reinforces the anxious partner's belief that they are the problem and that their need for closeness is a burden or flaw. Because the anxious partner is caught in this dynamic, it becomes almost impossible for them to get clarity on what's really happening. They may misinterpret their partner's avoidance as rejection or think the narcissist's selfishness means they're unlovable. The result is a heightened state of anxiety and emotional exhaustion, driven not by their own feelings, but by the toxic interplay of these incompatible attachment styles. This is why recognizing this dynamic is so crucial. It's not just a difficult relationship, it's a specific pattern that actively undermines the anxious person's sense of self and security. Avoidant partners have a natural tendency to emotionally distance themselves when things start to get too close or intense. This behavior is often driven by fear of vulnerability or a deep discomfort with emotional intimacy. When they sense their partner's need for closeness growing stronger, avoidants instinctively pull back to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed or trapped. For someone with an anxious attachment style, whose core need is connection and reassurance, this withdrawal feels like abandonment. It creates a painful push-pull dynamic where the anxious person reaches out for closeness only to be met with distance and silence. The avoidance retreat isn't necessarily about rejecting the anxious partner personally. It's often a defense mechanism designed to keep emotions manageable. But the anxious partner experiences this as a direct refusal or disinterest, which triggers their fear of being unloved or unworthy. They want to close the gap, to bridge the emotional distance, but the avoidance instinct is to widen it. This mismatch creates confusion and frustration. The anxious person feels compelled to try harder to fix the distance, which only makes the avoidant feel more pressured and in turn more likely to pull away. When narcissistic traits are added to the avoidant style, this distance becomes even more pronounced. Narcissists tend to be highly self-secret and lack empathy for their partner's emotional needs. They prioritize their own desires and often dismiss or minimize the feelings of others. So, when an avoidant partner also exhibits narcissistic tendencies, their emotional unavailability is compounded by a lack of concern for how their actions impact their partner. They might respond to the anxious person's efforts for connection with indifference or even subtle manipulation, leaving the anxious partner feeling invisible or unimportant. This combination leaves the anxious person trapped in a cycle where their vulnerability is met with avoidance and self-centeredness. The anxious partner is sensitive, expressive, and desperate for emotional validation, while the avoidant narcissist is cold, distant, and focused on themselves. This emotional mismatch means the anxious person rarely feels truly seen or valued for who they are. Instead, they feel like they're chasing a moving target, always reaching for connection but never quite catching it. The painful result is that the anxious partner internalizes these experiences as personal rejection. They believe their need for closeness is a flaw or a burden, not realizing that the problem lies in the avoidant narcissist's inability or unwillingness to meet them emotionally. This misunderstanding fuels further anxiety, perpetuating the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal and making it harder for the anxious individual to break free or build healthier relationships. Anxiety in relationships where one partner has an anxious attachment style and the other displays avoidant or narcissistic traits is often misunderstood as a personal flaw or weakness. But in reality, anxiety is a natural, even expected emotional response to confusing and inconsistent relational experiences. When your emotional needs for connection, reassurance, and safety aren't reliably met, your mind and body respond with heightened alertness, sensitivity, and stress. It's not that you're overreacting or being too much. You're simply reacting to an environment that feels unpredictable and unsafe. For someone with anxious attachment, the inconsistency of emotional availability from their partner triggers deep-seated fears rooted in past experiences, fears of abandonment, rejection, or being unloved. When a partner who is avoidant pulls away or refuses to engage emotionally, or when a narcissistic partner prioritizes themselves and neglects the other's feelings, it creates an emotional roller coaster. This roller coaster is filled with highs when the anxious partner feels close and lows when they experience distance, silence, or coldness. The mind naturally tries to make sense of this roller coaster by becoming hypervigilant, scanning for signs of trouble, and trying to predict the next withdrawal or rejection. This hypervigilance is often mistaken for an overreaction, but it's actually a survival mechanism. It's the brain's way of trying to protect you from emotional pain by anticipating it before it happens. The anxiety feels like a flaw because it is so uncomfortable, but it's important to remember that it's a response to the confusing signals your partner is sending, not a defect in you. It's your nervous system's way of trying to create some order out of emotional chaos. Unfortunately, when anxiety is framed as a personal flaw, it leads to self-blame and shame. People with anxious attachment may try to suppress their feelings or apologize for their needs, thinking that if they just acted differently, their partner would be more available. But this response only deepens the cycle because it ignores the real issue, the partner's emotional inconsistency and unavailability. Recognizing anxiety as a natural response to relational inconsistency helps shift perspective. Instead of blaming yourself for feeling anxious, you can begin to see your feelings as valid signals telling you that something in the relationship isn't working. This understanding opens the door to healthier choices, whether that means setting boundaries, seeking support, or choosing relationships where your emotional needs are honored rather than dismissed or ignored. Anxiety in this light is not a flaw, but a call to awareness. Becoming aware of the toxic dynamic between anxious, narcissistic, and avoidant attachment styles is a powerful step toward reclaiming control over your emotional well-being. When you understand that the anxiety you feel isn't a reflection of your worth, but rather a response to an unhealthy pattern, you can start to break free from the cycle of self-blame and confusion. This awareness allows you to see the relationship for what it truly is, a mismatch that actively undermines your needs rather than a personal failure on your part. Once you recognize the push-pull dynamic created by an avoidant narcissist, it becomes easier to stop internalizing their behavior as your fault. You begin to realize that their emotional unavailability and lack of empathy are about their limitations, not your shortcomings. This shift in perspective is crucial because it gives you the space to stop trying to fix or control the relationship through constant reassurance or over-apologizing. Instead, you can redirect that energy towards setting healthy boundaries and prioritizing your own emotional safety. Understanding this dynamic also helps you to identify the red flags early on in future relationships. When you become aware of what an avoidant or narcissistic partner's behavior looks like, pulling away when you get closer, minimizing your feelings, prioritizing themselves over the relationship, you can protect yourself from falling into the same pattern again. This self-awareness empowers you to make more conscious choices about who you allow into your life and how much emotional energy you invest. Moreover, this recognition opens the door to seeking out relationships where vulnerability is met with empathy and respect. You start to understand that your need for closeness is not a burden, but a valid part of who you are. You learn to seek partners who are emotionally available and willing to engage authentically, rather than those who trigger your anxiety through inconsistency or manipulation. This can be transformative because it shifts the focus from changing yourself to finding someone who values and matches your emotional rhythm. Ultimately, awareness is the first step toward healing. It gives you the power to break free from the trap and reclaim your self-worth. When you stop blaming yourself and start understanding the real source of your anxiety, you can begin to build healthier, more fulfilling relationships based on mutual respect and genuine connection. This is where true growth and happiness begin, when you no longer feel trapped by old patterns, but instead choose love and connection that honor who you truly are. To wrap this up, it's so important to remember that feeling anxious in a relationship doesn't mean you're broken or at fault. It often means you're caught in a confusing and painful dynamic shaped by deeper attachment patterns that aren't your responsibility to fix alone. By understanding how narcissistic and avoidant behaviors interact with your anxious feelings, you reclaim your power and start to see yourself with greater compassion and clarity. You deserve relationships where your vulnerability is met with care, not with distance or self-doubt. Thank you so much for listening and being open to exploring this challenging topic. Remember, healing begins the moment you stop blaming yourself and start recognizing the patterns that no longer serve you. I wish you strength and courage on your journey toward healthier, happier connections. Take care and thank you again.